Their engagement was the talk of their small town when it happened. Sweet Caroline and her sweeter beau, Mark. They had been high school sweethearts. Mark had popped the question on Caroline's birthday, and she had said yes. It was a union everyone celebrated because they fit each other like a glove. Caroline was studying to be an esthetician, and Mark had just taken his MCAT. Everything seemed to be going perfectly, until Caroline called off their wedding, just 2 days before the function. She had sent Mark a frantic text message and taken off. Her family was left puzzled, and Mark was left heartbroken. Their small-town skeptics thought things had been too perfect. Mark and Caroline had been together for many years. This seemed less likely a case of cold feet, and more like Caroline had grown tired of Mark. What no one knew was that Caroline had never wanted to cancel her wedding. She would never have dreamed of it. Mark was everything she'd ever wanted in a guy. She had been excited to marry him. She had made the perfect registry for their new home. They had put down the deposit for the apartment closest to Mark's university. The proposed venue for the wedding had been the small chapel by their high school. The reception was supposed to be a garden party, and her Aunt Judy was supposed to have made everyone her stone oven margarita pizza. Her best friend, Mary, who was also Mark's sister, was supposed to be her maid of honor. They had decided to forego a honeymoon and instead use that money to buy a car. It was supposed to have been the happiest day of her life. But 2 days before the fateful Sunday of her dreams, Caroline had gone for her final dress fitting. Mary had not joined her because she had gone to check on the venue. Caroline had a slight headache in the morning, but didn't think much of it. The seamstress was a family friend who ran the only bridal boutique they had in town. It was called Bertha's Boutique because Bertha was the seamstress's name. Bertha had called Caroline in despite already having done 3 fittings. This was because the dress needed constant alteration. Bertha had chided Caroline about going on a diet and losing too much weight. Caroline had told the seamstress she wasn't on a diet. They had both thought it was because of the wedding stress. When Bertha brought out the pearl-embedded white gown, Caroline felt the back of her throat itch. Her headache had gotten worse. She asked Bertha's assistant for a glass of water. They forewent the champagne because Caroline didn't like the taste of alcohol as of late. She drank a little bit of water and felt better. She tried the dress on and groaned to Bertha because the waistline sagged around her body and didn't flatter her at all. She complained about the sleeves being too loose. She pulled at the fabric and turned to Bertha. Bertha looked over her glasses with a confused frown. She told Caroline they had altered it as requested. Caroline felt tired and didn't say anything. She stepped out of the dress because she was starting to feel nauseous. The assistant brought her more water, but she excused herself and went to the toilet. Caroline was used to these headaches. She had them from a young age. Lately, they had become worse. She felt tired and couldn't stand around for long periods without feeling sick. She washed her face and looked at herself in the mirror. Her usually round face had become thinner over the past few months. Many people had complimented her. She hadn't given it much thought. Her cheekbones were highlighted, but so were her dark circles. The itch in her throat was back, and she tried to swallow the bile. She threw up into the sink and scrunched her nose at the taste in her mouth. She looked down to see rust-colored liquid all over the sink. She had thrown up blood. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and washed the sink. She washed her face again. She had thrown up last week too, and it had looked the same. She had thought it was a one-off thing, but she was beginning to worry it wasn't. Outside the toilet, Bertha's assistant looked at her with a worried expression. She told Caroline she had heard the sound of her throwing up. Caroline told the assistant not to worry. She told Bertha she would return in the evening and asked her to try and tighten the waistband a little more. Caroline got into her car and thought about what to do next. She had to go to the hospital, but she couldn't go to the one in their town because Mark's father worked there. She didn't want her in-laws to worry, and she didn't want Mark to find out either. The last time she had told Mark about her headaches, Mark had told her off for drinking too much. She had been defensive about it, which almost led to an argument. Caroline didn't like fighting with Mark. She would rather keep things to herself than tell him. He worried a lot about her. Sometimes he worried too much. Caroline decided to drive over to the next town. There was a big hospital there, and she didn't have to worry about Mark finding out. After throwing up, her headache had gone away. She could still taste the blood in her mouth, even when she was driving. It took her 30 minutes to get to the hospital. On her way there, she thought of all the possible reasons why she was feeling sick. She hoped it was just the wedding stress. She didn't want to consider any other reason. She walked into the ER and asked for a doctor. They told her a GP was available on the second floor, but they needed her to fill out a form. Caroline filled out the form and made her way to the second floor. She felt her phone go off in her dress pockets, but she didn't check who it was. She needed to meet the doctor first. The doctor was a kind-looking older woman who asked her for basic information. Caroline told her that she hadn't been feeling well for a few weeks. When the doctor asked her to elaborate, Caroline told her she felt nauseous and couldn't eat sometimes. She also said she had trouble standing for long periods and had bad headaches. The doctor listened carefully with a strange look on her face. She asked Caroline if she would mind if she were to share the information with another doctor. The other doctor came in a little while later. He was a neurologist. They asked Caroline if they could run some tests. She asked them what was wrong. The doctors told Caroline they couldn't be sure until the test results were out. Caroline had to think fast. She didn't want to go back home now that she had come all the way here, but she didn't want to do the tests alone. She also wasn't sure if her insurance would cover the bills. She thought about it for a while, then told the doctor she would like to go ahead with the tests. It felt like the best option. If nothing was wrong, she would feel at ease at the wedding. If something was wrong, Caroline thought it would be better to know now than later. A nurse asked Caroline to change into a hospital gown and gave her a trash bag to keep her dress in. Caroline was then asked to sign a few forms. She wasn't familiar with medical terms, but she knew an MRI was a scan. It made her worry a little, but she couldn't back out now. She signed the forms and walked with the nurse to the MRI room. The whole place was white and very neat. Caroline was asked to lie down on a hard-looking mattress connected to a machine. She was told to hold her breath during the scan. She wondered about Mark's whereabouts as the machine flashed a light over. It was done in a few seconds. She was helped off the bed by the nurse, who told her they would need a blood test too. Caroline agreed to it and was taken to the laboratory. The tests were done fairly fast. She was asked to change and wait in the doctor's office until the results were out. She changed out of the hospital gown and into her dress. She checked her phone, and she had 3 missed calls. 1 from Mark and 2 from Mary. She checked her text messages through the notifications. Mark had asked where she was, and if she would like to meet for tea. Mary had sent her pictures, probably of the venue, and a message asking her to call her back when she was free. Caroline bit her nails and stared at the clock in the office. She could call them and let them know that she was at the hospital, but knowing them, they would probably drop everything and rush over. She didn't want to worry them unnecessarily. She thought the results would come out normal and the doctor would advise her to take some vitamins. She didn't expect both doctors to come in with pale faces and a stack of papers. They greeted her and asked her if she would like to lie down. She declined and asked them what was wrong. She knew from their faces that there was something wrong. They told her they had found a tumor in her brain over a critical area. The neurologist explained that some tumors are harmless, but this one was not. The tumor in Caroline's brain was a dangerous one that needed immediate attention to reduce its impact. Caroline didn't say anything until they were done listing out her symptoms and how they would only worsen over time. Her headache was back. She wanted to cry, but she didn't. The doctors asked her if there were any loved ones they could contact on her behalf. She shook her head and asked them to give her some time. They looked at her sadly. Caroline trembled as she walked out of the office. She sat on the metal chair outside and tried not to cry. She thought about what to do and who to tell. Then she thought about the wedding. She thought about the beautiful dress at Bertha's boutique. She thought about the new apartment with the nice windows. She thought about the blue car waiting in Mark's garage. Then she thought about Mark and his kind eyes. She couldn't stop crying when she thought about Mark because she didn't know how to tell him. They had to cancel the wedding, she realized. They couldn't get married when she was this sick. Mark deserved better than to have to spend his days near her deathbed. She wanted him to have a good life. She didn't care as much about what happened to her. She wiped her face and decided she had to cancel the wedding, but she had to do it in such a way that Mark would not try to talk her out of it. She didn't want Mark to feel sorry for her. She decided the best way to tell him was through text. It felt brutal, but it had to be done. Mark, I don't think I want to go ahead with the wedding. It doesn't feel right. We'll talk soon, but for now, give me some space. Please don't call me. I will not answer. I'm sorry, but I can't do this. She read and reread the text a few times. It sounded like something she would say. She hit send before she could overthink it. The nurse from earlier approached her just as she switched her phone off. Caroline asked the nurse if the doctors had left. They were still in the office, and they were discussing her test reports. She walked in and apologized for leaving earlier. They told her they understood her position and didn't want to push her. She asked them about treatment plans. The neurologist told her they would have to monitor her progress for a few more days and run a few more tests before they could conclude their diagnosis. They explained that it would be ideal for her to admit herself to the wards. She told them she would. When she stepped outside, she slipped her engagement ring off her finger and into her purse. Caroline admitted herself into the oncology wards later that day. The exhaustion of the day's events and the sadness of having to cancel her wedding put her to sleep. The next morning, the tests began. There were multiple blood tests done. She was taken into 2 more scans during her first week at the ward. She didn't switch her phone on. She felt guilty for having left everything behind, but she didn't dare to tell anyone about what was happening. She thought about Mark often as she watched doctors walk in and out of the ward. She knew he would make a good doctor, and she hoped he wouldn't hold too harsh of a grudge against her if they were to meet. Caroline began radiation treatment 1 month into her stay at the hospital. She felt weak after the treatments. She often thought about how she could die at the hospital, away from her loved ones. She preferred that over having them worry over her. Over time, she could feel herself getting better. The doctors were happy with her progress. She felt like her engagement and almost wedding to Mark had been a dream. She spent most of her time in the hospital library, reading and writing when she had the energy to. The staff was kind enough to provide her with paper and pens when she asked. She wrote letters to her family and had them sent with the help of one of the wardens. She didn't add a return address, so they couldn't reply, even if they wanted to. 3 months into treatment, the doctors told Caroline she could get discharged. She would still need treatment, but it didn't have to be frequent. She told them she didn't mind staying at the hospital. The doctors didn't question her, but they strongly recommended her a change of scenery. She took her time deciding. In the middle of her 4th month at the hospital, she decided to switch her phone on. She charged it up with the help of another patient's charger. She watched the notifications pile up, but she disregarded them. She went to her contacts and clicked on her mom's number. She hoped her parents weren't too mad at her. She had made up her mind to return home, and she knew she had a lot of explaining to do. Her mother's familiar voice made Caroline cry. She told her where she was and said she would explain things later. Her mother seemed to be too relieved to question her. Caroline's family came running into the ward later that day. Her mother was the first to hug her. Her father asked her how she was feeling, and her sister broke down in tears. They had been worried sick, they told her, but Mark had told them she would be back. Caroline felt grateful for Mark. She explained her diagnosis and how frightening it had been to start treatment. She told them she had felt overwhelmed and had chosen to run away instead of facing them. She asked them if they had received her letters. Her mother explained that the letters had helped ease their worries because Caroline had sounded safe. Caroline returned home that night to the small town she had run away from. She felt sick with excitement at seeing her house. She was still quite frail and had to be assisted to the house. When she stepped in, she saw Mary seated in the living room. Mary's face lit up at the sight of her friend, but she was careful not to hug Caroline. They sat in the living room, and Mary told Caroline about the things that had happened after she had canceled her wedding. Mark had spoken to the pastor and the venue director to postpone the date indefinitely. They had cleared up as many rumors as they could, but Mary warned Caroline that a few people still believed she had eloped with someone else. Caroline understood that people were only trying to make sense of the strange situation. She didn't hold it against them. Lastly, Mary told her Mark had left for university on his own. He had sat for his MCAT the previous week. Caroline wondered if they still had a chance to sort things out or if they were better off as friends. Mary had dinner with Caroline's family. They tried not to speak about the canceled wedding. Caroline was grateful for that. Before Mary left, she invited Caroline over for Thanksgiving dinner. "Mark is coming down. You should talk it out," she said. Then as an afterthought, she asked Caroline to check her text messages. Later that night, as Caroline stepped into bed, she pulled her phone out. She plugged it into her charger and opened the text messages. Her chat with Mark was at the top with over 1,000 texts waiting to be read. She opened the chat with a smile and read through each of the texts. It took her some time to realize Mark had texted her every day since their canceled wedding. The earliest texts were questions. He had been looking for answers. When he realized she would not be replying, he texted her random details from his day. She smiled wider when she realized he had also sent pictures. There was one from the day he'd moved into the apartment. She recognized things from their registry. It felt nice to know people had still gifted them to him, even after their wedding had been canceled. She scrolled through the texts, realizing she still loved Mark. She reached over to her purse and pulled out the ring she had tucked away. She wore it to bed that night and to the Thanksgiving dinner where Mark proposed for the second time.